She sat on the front steps with her hands wrapped in white bandages, insisting it was an accident. Nobody believed the story less than the man watching from across the street, a stranger the whole neighborhood crossed to avoid. He'd seen lies like hers before, the careful kind, rehearsed to protect someone else. What he didn't know yet was how far he'd have to go to prove it, or how much this frightened old woman's silence would cost them both before the truth finally broke the surface. He climbed off his bike anyway. He always did. Marcus Doyle had learned a long time ago that engines told the truth even when people didn't. A knock in a cylinder meant something was wearing down. A hiss from a radiator meant something was about to fail. Machines didn't lie to spare your feelings. People did that instead every single day, and Marcus had grown so used to it that he barely noticed anymore. Until the afternoon, he heard a woman lie to a paramedic on Fenwick Street, and something in him refused to let it go. It was late September in Nashville, the kind of afternoon where the heat still clung to the asphalt, even though the light had gone gold and low. Marcus was riding back from the garage where he worked 3 days a week, more out of habit than necessity, fixing carburetors for men half his age who called him old-timer, with a kind of affection he pretended not to notice. His Harley rumbled beneath him, familiar as a heartbeat, and he was thinking about nothing in particular, a rare and welcome state for a man whose mind usually ran too hot, when he saw the ambulance lights flashing 2 blocks down, painting the low brick houses in alternating red and white. He slowed instinctively, not because he needed to see, because something about the stillness of the small crowd gathered on the sidewalk made him uneasy, the way a silence in an engine bay sometimes meant the worst kind of trouble. An elderly woman sat on the front steps of a modest grey house. A paramedic crouched in front of her, gently holding her forearm. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the bandaging on her hands, stark white against skin gone thin and papery with age. A few neighbors stood at a respectful distance, arms crossed, murmuring the way people do when they don't know whether to be worried or nosy. Marcus eased his bike to the curb, cut the engine, and swung his leg over. He didn't know why he stopped. He told himself later it was simple curiosity, though he suspected even then that something in him recognized trouble the way an old dog recognizes a storm before the sky changes color. "Ma'am, can you tell me again how this happened?" The paramedic was asking, his voice patient but professional. The woman, small, silver-haired, wrapped in a cardigan too heavy for the weather, lifted her chin with a kind of practiced dignity. "I told you, I was cooking. I reached for the pot before I thought, and I burned myself. I'm old, not stupid. I know how to handle my own kitchen." "These burns," the paramedic said carefully, glancing at her palms, "they're not really consistent with grabbing a hot pot, ma'am. The pattern is—" "I don't care what pattern you think you see," she snapped, though her voice trembled at the edges. "I did it myself. There's no need to make a circus out of it." Marcus stood at the edge of the small gathered crowd, arms crossed over his leather vest, watching the way her eyes moved. Quick, darting toward the house behind her, toward an upstairs window where a curtain had just barely shifted, as though someone standing behind it had let go of the fabric a second too late. He'd spent 20 years around men who lied about their injuries, motorcyclists who insisted they were fine after a spill that should have broken bones, old friends who said they were handling it when their marriages were falling apart in front of everyone. He knew the shape of a lie the way he knew the shape of a stripped bolt, subtle but unmistakable once you'd seen it enough times. This woman was lying, and she was terrified. The paramedic finished dressing her hands, gave her a card with a follow-up number, and reluctantly let her wave him off. The ambulance pulled away a few minutes later, lights dimming, and the small crowd began to disperse the way crowds do. Quickly, with the practiced indifference of people who didn't want to get involved. Marcus didn't leave. He stayed by his bike, pretending to check something on the handlebar, watching the old woman gather herself slowly and painfully to her feet. She noticed him almost immediately, People always noticed him first. The tattoos, the leather, the silver in his beard that did nothing to soften the impression of size and roughness. He watched her expression do what most people's did. A flicker of wariness, an instinct to look away and hurry inside. But she didn't hurry. She was in too much pain to hurry, and something about that slowness, that vulnerability, made Marcus's chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low, the same voice he used to calm spooked animals or nervous rookies at the garage. "You need a hand getting inside." She eyed him from head to boots, the way people did when trying to decide if a stranger was dangerous or merely large. "I'm fine," she said, the same words she'd given the paramedic, delivered with the same brittle finality. "I didn't ask if you were fine," Marcus said. "I asked if you needed a hand." Something in her face shifted. Not trust, not yet, but a kind of surprised recognition, as if she hadn't expected a man who looked like him to speak so gently. "Eleanor," she said finally, reluctantly. "Eleanor Hastings. Marcus Doyle." He nodded toward the steps. "Let me help you up, at least. Then I'll be on my way." She hesitated, glanced once more at the upstairs window, and then allowed him to take her elbow, his grip careful, aware of how easily he could break something with his own careless strength. As they climbed the steps together, he felt her flinch. Not from her hands, but from something deeper, some old wound that had nothing to do with burns. At the door, she thanked him stiffly and made it clear, without saying so, that their conversation was over. Marcus let her go. He walked back to his bike, swung his leg over, and sat there a moment longer than he needed to, staring at that grey house with its shifting curtain and its silences that didn't add up. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself the same thing 3 more times as he rode away, and none of the 3 times did he believe it. That night, he lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling of his small house on the edge of town, listening to the distant hum of the interstate. He thought about Eleanor Hastings' hands, wrapped in white bandages, and the particular way she had lied, not smoothly, not like someone protecting her own dignity, but carefully, like someone protecting somebody else. He'd seen that kind of lie before. A long time ago, in a house not so different from hers, spoken by a woman who was not so different from her either. He had been young then, and he hadn't understood what he was looking at until it was too late to do anything about it. He wasn't young anymore. The next morning, before he could talk himself out of it, Marcus found himself riding back toward Fenwick Street, telling himself it was only to check that she was all right, telling himself again that it wasn't his business. But some part of him, the part that had learned, the hard way, what silence like hers usually meant, already knew he wasn't going to let this go. The grey house looked different in morning light, smaller, more tired, its paint peeling in places Marcus hadn't noticed the day before. He parked his bike across the street and sat for a moment, watching. There was no movement behind the curtains this time. A newspaper still lay untouched on the walkway, its plastic sleeve beaded with dew. He almost turned around. A voice in his head, reasonable, self-preserving, reminded him that he was a 50-something biker with no business inserting himself into an old woman's private affairs. But another voice, quieter and more stubborn, reminded him of the way Eleanor's eyes had darted to that window, the tremble beneath her defiance, the practiced ease of a lie told too many times. He crossed the street and knocked. It took nearly a full minute before the door opened. Just a crack, security chain still fastened. Eleanor's face appeared in the gap, pale and startled. "Mr. Doyle," she said, clearly surprised he'd remembered, or that he'd come back at all. "I told you yesterday I'm fine." "I believe that you told me that," Marcus said carefully. "I didn't say I believed it." Her mouth tightened. "I don't know what you think you saw." "I think I saw a woman scared of something in her own house," he said. quiet but direct, the way he might address a horse that startled easily. No sudden moves, no raised voice, just steady presence. "And I think whatever burned your hands wasn't a pot on a stove." For a long moment, she said nothing, and Marcus thought she might simply shut the door in his face. He wouldn't have blamed her. Instead, something in her posture sagged, just slightly, the fight going out of her shoulders, the way air leaves a tire with a slow puncture. "You should go," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "Please, for your own good." "For my own good," Marcus repeated. "Or for someone else's?" Her eyes flicked upward, toward the ceiling, toward whatever room existed above them. And in that single, unguarded glance, Marcus understood he had been right. Someone else lived in that house. Someone whose presence made an elderly woman flinch at the sound of her own front door. "Eleanor," he said her name gently. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I've got no badge, no clipboard, nothing official about me at all. I'm just a man who noticed something wasn't right and who isn't in a hurry to pretend he didn't." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face the way people search for something they're afraid to find, and even more afraid not to. Whatever she found there, Marcus never knew exactly what, made her finally unlatch the chain. 10 minutes, she said. Then you need to leave, and you need to forget you were ever here. The inside of the house was neat in the anxious way of someone who cleaned to keep her hands busy rather than because she cared about tidiness. Marcus noticed things immediately, the way he noticed a bad weld or a mismatched bolt, a chair pushed slightly too far from the dining table, as though someone had stood up too fast. A hole in the drywall near the kitchen doorway, poorly patched with spackle that hadn't been sanded down. A stove with a single dented pot sitting on the back burner, untouched, clean. "Your son," Marcus said, not quite a question. "That's who's upstairs." Eleanor's hands trembled as she gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table. "Todd," she said finally, the name coming out like something long held back. "He's been staying with me since the spring. He lost his job, his apartment. He had nowhere else to go, and he's my son, Mr. Doyle. What was I supposed to do?" "Nobody's asking you to turn away your own child," Marcus said. "But your hands didn't get burned reaching for a pot, and we both know it." Eleanor was quiet for a long time, staring down at her bandaged palms, as though they belonged to someone else. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He gets angry. He doesn't mean it. He's not a bad man, Mr. Doyle. He's just lost. He drinks more than he should, and when I try to talk to him about it, about getting help, he—" She stopped herself. "He hurt you," Marcus finished for her. "It was an accident," she said quickly, too quickly, the same rehearsed line she'd given the paramedic. "He didn't mean for the pan to—" Her voice cracked. "He was upset. He threw it. I put my hands up. That's all. It's not what you think." Marcus felt something cold settle into his chest, an old and familiar anger he had spent years learning to control. He kept his voice level, though it cost him. "Eleanor, that's exactly what I think. And it's not an accident. It's not the first time, is it?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Why haven't you called anyone?" Marcus asked. "Family, police, anybody?" "Because he's my son," Eleanor said, and for the first time, real tears gathered in her eyes, sharp with a grief that went far deeper than bruised skin. "Because if I call the police, they'll arrest him, and then what? He'll have a record. He'll never recover from that. He's already lost everything else." "And if you don't call anyone," Marcus said gently, "what happens the next time he's angry? What happens if it's worse than a pot of hot water?" Eleanor flinched as though he'd struck her himself, and Marcus immediately regretted his bluntness, though he didn't take the words back. Some truths needed saying plainly, however much they hurt. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Both of them froze, eyes lifting toward the ceiling. Footsteps, slow and heavy, crossed the room above them and then stopped. "You need to go," Eleanor whispered, panic flooding her voice now. "Please, Mr. Doyle, if he comes down and sees you here—" "I'm not afraid of him," Marcus said quietly. "I'm not afraid for you," Eleanor said, gripping his sleeve with a bandaged hand, wincing at her own grip. "I'm afraid for what happens to me after you leave." The words landed like a blow. Marcus looked at her, really looked, at the fragile set of her shoulders, the fear etched permanently now into the lines around her eyes, and understood with sudden and complete clarity that walking away today would mean leaving her exactly where he found her, alone, frightened and trapped inside her own home by the one person who was supposed to protect her. He stood, but not to leave. "Give me your neighbor's number," he said. "The one who was outside yesterday. Grace, wasn't it?" Eleanor blinked, startled by the shift. "Why?" "Because you're not calling the police today," Marcus said. "But somebody's going to start keeping an eye on this house. Somebody's going to make sure the next time something happens, it doesn't happen in silence." For the first time since he'd met her, Eleanor Hastings looked at him not with wariness, but with something dangerously close to hope. Grace Whitmore answered her door in gardening gloves. Dirt smudged along one cheek, and regarded Marcus with the particular suspicion reserved for large men in leather vests who show up uninvited on quiet residential streets. "You're the one who helped Eleanor up her steps yesterday," she said before he could introduce himself. Word travelled fast on streets like Fenwick. "I am," Marcus said, "and I think you already know more about what's happening in that house than you've said out loud." Grace's jaw tightened. She glanced past him toward Eleanor's house, then stepped back to let him inside, closing the door with the particular care of someone accustomed to being unheard. "I've called it in before," she admitted, once they were seated in her small, cluttered living room. "Twice. Both times officers came, talked to Todd, talked to Eleanor, and left with nothing, because Eleanor wouldn't say a word against him. You can't force someone to press charges they refuse to press, Mr. Doyle." "Marcus," he said, "and I'm not asking you to force anything. I'm asking what you've seen." Grace hesitated, then began to speak. Carefully at first, then with the unburdening rush of someone who had been holding something in for far too long. She told him about the raised voices that carried through thin walls on bad nights, about Eleanor's sudden reluctance to garden in her front yard where neighbors used to see her most mornings, about the way Todd's truck sometimes sat in the driveway for days, engine cold, curtains drawn, as though the house itself was holding its breath. "She used to bring me tomatoes from her garden every summer," Grace said quietly. "She hasn't grown tomatoes in 2 years." Marcus absorbed this in silence, feeling the old familiar heat building behind his ribs, not the reckless anger of youth, but something steadier and more dangerous. The anger of a man who had learned exactly how much damage silence could cause and had promised himself a long time ago that he would never again stand by and let it happen. "I want to help her," Marcus said, "but she's terrified of what happens to her son if this comes out, and I understand that fear isn't irrational. I've seen what the system does to people once they're inside it." "Then what do you propose?" Grace asked, "because I've tried everything I know." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, turning the problem over in his mind, the way he might turn over a stubborn engine part, looking for the angle that would finally loosen it. The system doesn't work when it only shows up once, asks questions and leaves. It needs consistency, presence. Todd's not going to hurt his mother in front of witnesses. Men like him rely on isolation, on nobody watching closely enough, long enough, to catch the pattern. So we take that isolation away. "You mean surveillance?" Grace asked, brow furrowing. "I mean community," Marcus said. "I've got friends, men and women who ride together, who look out for each other because most of us learned the hard way that nobody else was going to. If Eleanor had people checking on her every day, not just once, not just when something's already gone wrong, but consistently, visibly, Todd would have to answer to more than just an old woman too scared to speak. Grace studied him for a long moment. You'd really do that? Organize something like that for a stranger? Marcus thought of a house from decades ago, of a woman who had also insisted she was fine, who had also flinched at sounds too small for anyone else to notice, who had died before anyone believed her enough to intervene. He thought of the guilt that had followed him for 30 years, quiet and constant, like an engine that never fully idled down. She's not a stranger to me anymore, he said simply, and I don't walk away from people who remind me of someone I already failed once. Grace didn't ask him to explain further, and he was grateful for that. Instead, she nodded slowly. All right, what do you need from me? Over the next several days, Marcus set his plan into motion with the quiet efficiency of a man used to solving mechanical problems with limited parts and limited time. He spoke to Ray and Victor, two of the older members of his riding club, men who had known hardship themselves and didn't need much convincing once he explained the situation. He spoke to Sam, who ran a small legal aid clinic downtown and had experience with elder protection orders. He even, reluctantly, spoke with Deputy Wayne Sutter, a cautious, weathered officer who had responded to Grace's earlier calls and remembered Eleanor's case with visible frustration. I want to help her, Sutter admitted during their conversation at a diner near the precinct, but my hands are tied without her cooperation. If you can get her to a place where she trusts the process enough to make a statement, I'll make sure it's handled properly. Until then, I can watch the house more closely, but that's the extent of what the law allows me to do. It wasn't enough. Marcus knew it wasn't enough, but it was a start, and starts were often the hardest part. Slowly, deliberately, motorcycles began appearing on Fenwick Street, not menacingly, not aggressively, but with the calm, visible regularity of men and women stopping to check on an elderly neighbor. Ray brought over tools to fix her sagging porch railing. Victor mowed her lawn on Saturday mornings, refusing payment. Sam stopped by twice a week under the pretense of checking on a friend of a friend, slowly building the kind of rapport that made Eleanor, bit by bit, begin to trust that someone outside her walls was truly paying attention. Todd noticed, of course. Marcus saw it in the way the truck's engine started more cautiously now, the way curtains no longer moved the instant a stranger appeared on the sidewalk. For the first time in longer than Eleanor could say, her house was being watched by people who meant her well instead of harm. And the weight of that watching, however unofficial, however imperfect, began to shift something in the fragile balance of that home. But Marcus knew, even as small victories accumulated, that watching alone wouldn't be enough forever. Todd's anger hadn't disappeared. It had only gone quieter, coiling somewhere out of sight, waiting for the moment the eyes finally looked away. The call came just after 11 at night, 3 weeks after Marcus had first knocked on Eleanor's door. It was Grace, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Marcus, you need to come, now! I hear shouting, real shouting, worse than before, and I think something's wrong." Marcus was already pulling on his boots before she finished the sentence. He called Ray and Victor as he ran for his bike, his hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his chest, years of controlled reflexes taking over where panic threatened to intrude. He called Sutter last, knowing the deputy would take longer to arrive, but needing the call on record regardless. The ride to Fenwick Street took 11 minutes that felt like an hour. When he arrived, Grace was already standing on her own porch, phone pressed to her ear, eyes fixed on Eleanor's house, where every light burned and the sound of shattering glass had just cut through the night air. Marcus didn't wait for backup. He crossed the street at a run, boots pounding against pavement, and pounded on the front door with a fist that had broken far tougher things than wood. "Eleanor, it's Marcus! Open the door!" Silence, then a muffled cry from somewhere inside. Eleanor's voice, pained and frightened, cut short as though a hand had covered her mouth. Marcus didn't hesitate. He threw his shoulder against the door once, twice, feeling the frame shudder and finally splinter on the third strike. He burst into the living room to find Todd Pearson standing over his mother, one hand raised, Eleanor cowering against the overturned dining table, a fresh cut above her eyebrow, bleeding into her silver hair. "Get away from her," Marcus said, his voice a low growl that filled the room with a warning even Todd's rage-clouded mind couldn't ignore. Todd turned, swaying slightly, reeking of whiskey, his eyes wide with the particular fury of a man cornered in the middle of his own violence. "This isn't your house," he snarled. "This isn't your family. Get out." "You're right," Marcus said, stepping fully into the room, positioning his body between Todd and Eleanor with deliberate, unhurried calm. "It's not my house. It's hers. And you don't get to put your hands on her in it. Not tonight, not ever again." Todd lunged, more out of drunken instinct than strategy, and Marcus caught his wrist mid-swing with the same steady grip he'd used 1,000 times to hold a spooked animal or a struggling engine part in place. He didn't strike back. He didn't need to. He simply held, immovable, until Todd's rage burned itself out against a strength he couldn't overcome, until the younger man sagged, suddenly and completely, into something closer to sobbing than shouting. "I didn't mean—" Todd started, the same broken phrase his mother had used so many times to excuse him. "I never meant to—" "I know," Marcus said, not unkindly, though his grip didn't loosen. "But meaning to and doing are two different things, and tonight you did." Sirens approached outside, red and blue lights spilling through the shattered doorway. Deputy Sutter arrived moments later, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had seen this pattern too many times to be surprised by it, but rarely with enough evidence to finally act. This time, there was no ambiguity to explain away. Eleanor's cut forehead, the overturned furniture, Todd's obvious intoxication, Marcus's first-hand account, Grace's corroborating call, the pieces finally aligned into something the system could no longer dismiss. As Sutter cuffed Todd, reading him his rights over the young man's quiet, defeated weeping, Marcus knelt beside Eleanor, gently helping her away from the wreckage of her overturned table. She was shaking, tears streaming freely now, decades of practiced denial finally collapsing under the weight of a truth too large to hide any longer. "I didn't want this," she whispered, staring at her son being led toward the patrol car. "I never wanted this for him." "I know," Marcus said gently, "but you didn't do this to him, Eleanor. He did this to himself, and to you, one choice at a time. You're not responsible for the ending of a story he's been writing for a long time." She turned to him then, her face a wreck of grief and exhaustion, and something else Marcus recognized instantly. The first fragile edges of relief, the kind that comes only after fear has finally been allowed to loosen its grip. "You didn't have to break my door down," she said, an unexpected watery laugh escaping her despite everything. "Old habit," Marcus said, managing a small, tired smile of his own. "I never was much good at waiting for permission when someone needed help." Grace arrived moments later, wrapping a blanket around Eleanor's shoulders, murmuring soft reassurances as paramedics moved in to treat the fresh wound above her eye. Ray and Victor pulled up shortly after, having broken every speed limit on the way over, standing watch on the porch with the same unspoken loyalty that had first brought their engines rumbling down Fenwick Street weeks earlier. For the first time, in longer than anyone could remember, Eleanor Hastings' house was full of people who had come not to hurt her, but to make absolutely certain nobody ever could again. 3 months later, Marcus rode down Fenwick Street on a cool December morning, exhaust curling white behind him in the crisp air, and found Eleanor kneeling in her front garden, gloved hands working carefully around the base of a small tomato plant, despite the season, coaxing it toward a sheltered spot near the porch where it might survive the coming frost. "Bit late in the year for tomatoes," Marcus said, cutting his engine and swinging off his bike. Eleanor glanced up, shading her eyes against the pale winter sun, and smiled, a real smile now, unguarded in a way it hadn't been the day he'd first met her. Grace gave me the seedling, said I was overdue. She brushed dirt from her knees as she rose, moving more easily now, the tension that had once lived permanently in her shoulders finally beginning to loosen. Todd started a treatment program last month. Court-ordered, but he's staying with it. I visit him on Sundays. How's that going? Marcus asked carefully. Slowly, Eleanor admitted. Some days he's angry I called the police, even though I didn't. You did. She gave him a knowing look, equal parts gratitude and gentle accusation. Other days he cries and tells me he's sorry, and I don't know yet if I believe him. But at least now there's a chance for it to be true. There wasn't before. Before there was just silence, and silence was killing both of us, slowly, in different ways. Marcus nodded, understanding more than she likely realized. He thought of the woman from his past again, the one he hadn't been able to save, and felt, for the first time in 30 years, something other than pure guilt when he remembered her. A quiet, hard-won peace, the sense of an old debt finally imperfectly repaid. The neighborhood's different now, Eleanor continued, gesturing toward the street, where Grace's garden had expanded onto a shared plot with 2 other neighbors, where children who used to avoid the quiet grey house now waved to her from their bicycles. People look at me differently. They stop and talk. I think before, everyone assumed an old woman living alone was simply private. Nobody imagined there might be something worth asking about. People assume a lot of things, Marcus said, glancing down at his own leather vest, his tattooed forearms, the silver beard that still made strangers cross the street, sometimes rather than walk past him. Most of them wrong. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, something warm and unmistakably fond in her expression. You know, when I first saw you on my front steps, I thought you were the last person in the world who'd want to get involved in an old woman's problems. Big, rough, covered in tattoos, everything I'd been taught to be wary of. And now? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Now I think the people everyone warns you about are sometimes the only ones who actually stop to look closely enough to see the truth, Eleanor said. Everyone else just sees what they expect to see and keeps walking. You saw what was actually there. Marcus said nothing for a moment, simply absorbing the quiet weight of her words, the particular satisfaction of a debt repaid not through grand gestures, but through the slow, patient work of simply refusing to look away. Grace mentioned you're doing this again, Eleanor said eventually. Watching out for people. There's a family 2 streets over. A young mother, 3 kids, a husband nobody's seen in weeks who apparently still comes around at strange hours. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same instinct that had first pulled him off his bike outside her house months earlier. I heard something similar, he admitted. Eleanor smiled, small and knowing, and reached out to pat his arm with a bandage-free hand, the burns long since healed into faint, fading scars. Then I suppose you better go introduce yourself. Just try not to break down any more doors this time if you can help it. Marcus laughed, a real laugh, rare and warm, and swung back onto his bike, engine roaring to life beneath him with the same steady rhythm that had carried him down this street on the day everything changed. As he pulled away, he glanced once more in his mirror at Eleanor standing in her garden, tomato plant sheltered against the coming winter, house full of light behind her, and felt the particular hard-earned satisfaction of a man who had finally, after all these years, learned exactly what it meant to stop and look closely enough to see the truth. The engine's rumble faded down Fenwick Street, carrying him toward whatever quiet, hidden trouble waited 2 streets over, because some habits, once learned the hard way, were worth keeping for good.